Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today we are going to talk about risk, which is an inevitable part of life. We make efforts, and so does the insurance industry, to insulate ourselves against risk. And yet we have to take risks in order to get ourselves out into life and be vital and be alive. Are we going to offend the gods if we take a risk, and will they retaliate? How do we weigh what kind of risks to take, and what does that entail in challenging ourselves appropriately and discerning with some degree of relevance to reality?
You know, it seems to me that obviously risk has always been a part of human experience, and that before the modern era, we dealt with risk by sort of appeals to prayer, for example, or a ritual, or somehow trying to get God on our side or invoke the deity to protect us against risk. But I think there was also a sensibility that this was just something that we had to deal with. There was more of a sense that we just had to accept it. And in a way, that relativized the kind of pre-modern ego, if you will. It made it clear where our place in the universe was, that our ability to mitigate or control things was limited. One of the realities, I think, of modern life is that we're so incredibly safe in a way. We're safe against diseases. We're safe against dying in childbirth in a way that was just unthinkable even a couple of 100 years ago. That it has cut us off from that sense of being just a small cork bobbing on the surface of a choppy ocean. And we maybe have an expectation that we can control risk more. It has a way of kind of making our ego feel too empowered. And then in the face of risk, we can feel really collapsed.
So what that constellates in me is this feeling that science and scientific progress has in some ways cut us off from the need to appease the gods or consider the gods in our decision making. In the ancient world, you know, if a boat was getting ready to launch, which was, by the way, a very risky process to hit the open seas, there's a tremendous amount of time spent in sacrifice and ritual preparation in order to create a condition which might allow things to be more propitious or to mitigate this psychological dimension of risk. and that science now has replaced those rituals of preparation, which may very well have helped us, no doubt. I mean, public hygiene really is a real, miracle.
It's a good thing.
We're not all dying of some terrible environmental, naivete, but pretending that these deep internal archetypal forces don't exist
Exactly.
because we have science behind us is making us unwell on that psychospiritual dimension.
So, in a way, what I'm linking this to is the development of ego writ large in the realm of the Enlightenment and science and control and objectivity that has given us many of the benefits of modern life, but it has also distanced us from the natural realm and the archetypal realm. And I wonder if, as a compensatory function, it's made us more fearful in some ways. Because we are not close to the natural world or the archetypal realm. So we should be able to control all kinds of things. And when we can't, it sparks a tremendous amount of anxiety and fear.
And being cut off from the natural world externally cuts us off from the instinctive world internally.
Exactly.
And what we know in the ancient part of ourselves is that instincts are reliable, and the instinctive voice can tell us with a sense of immediacy where danger lay in our environment. So to be missing that, I think, would contribute to a general atmosphere of fear and danger, because we no longer have the equipment to assess things accurately.
Well, and we can't tolerate, it's very difficult to tolerate that there is risk that cannot be mitigated. We cannot make the world perfectly safe. We wake up every morning and there is the possibility that we will face utter disaster. And that is just a fact of life. And we have to be robust enough. I mean, Deb, you were talking about kind of ego development. It takes a certain amount of ego strength to say, yes, if I take this course, whatever it might be, something terrible could happen, and I will be able to withstand that somehow.
Yeah. I'm comparing what I imagine was the case in life not all that long ago. In your example, Joseph, of getting ready to embark on a sailing trip and propitiating the gods. That life itself, childbirth, for example, life itself was risk to live. Whereas now, I think oftentimes, at least what I encounter, is risk that is much more psychological, that is not putting one's life in danger, but the risk of going to graduate school or taking a new job that's across the country or in a different country, the risk of getting married and making a commitment, lifelong commitment to someone, or choosing to have a child or not.
Or even just risking not being liked or risking being made to feel like a fool because you go to the party and you don't talk to anyone, or risking being laughed at because you said your lines wrong in the play or whatever. These little things that I think can really render us paralyzed.
And I think what we're saying is that as science and technology and human consciousness and capacity have evolved, there is a diminishment in true disasters in the way that they could happen in the ancient world. And so in the modern age, we've replaced true disasters with postmodern fantasies so that, I can't risk being uncomfortable. Or what if I make that decision and it's displeasing, or it's not as much fun as I thought it was going to be, or I take that risk and then I have to suffer disappointment.
or shame,
or
or
shame.
failure, or being socially ostracized. So it's moved in. Rather, it's no longer so much in the external world, although, of course, in many places it is.
Yes, of course.
But we're talking about what has happened in the internal world, that the fear of going to the party and not being able to talk to anybody. I showed up and I was dressed wrong. Everybody else was in one kind of clothing and I was in another. I flunked out of graduate school. How can I possibly go home and face everybody?
A kind of imaginal disasters, of fantasy disasters. And this brings up that tension between factual risks and risks to our personal narrative, or which we call perceived risks. And for many people, the risk to the personal narrative and the risk or the perceived risk has become the primary fear that then seems to guide people's decisions. And that's very questionable. And we may find ourselves living a very truncated life.
Well, and we know that, humans are not very good at actually assessing risk, that we can overstate things because of their emotional content. We can overstate, for example, the fear, the risk of flying in an airplane or getting eaten by a great white shark. We tend to over exaggerate those, and we tend to underestimate certain other risks. So we didn't evolve to be able to accurately assess these kinds of events that happen rarely or commonly, and figure and use that information to determine our behavior.
Yeah, there are all kinds of statistics about, the great rarity of airplane crashes or great white shark disasters versus automobile fatalities. Virtually no one is scared of getting in the car to take an automobile trip.
And I think that part of why people aren't that scared to get in the car, I imagine there are many reasons, because I've thought about this quite a bit. But I think part of it is because we're so reliant on our cars, and many of us couldn't really function without them. So we can't afford to accurately take on how dangerous that is, because it would be too crippling for many of us.
Well, I think what I'm hearing is that as human beings, our psyches have also become so fragile in the modern age that we will avoid confronting true risk.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
Choose to focus on a neurotic risk, a neurotic suffering. That I don't want to think about that because it's risky to be uncomfortable. So therefore, I am not going to consider what could be truly dangerous. And that system of preferring the neurotic concern is incredibly encapsulated and resistant to information. And we've all experienced that while we're doing analysis. We'll come upon a certain belief structure inside of someone, a kind of fantastical avoidance of risk, the risk of leaving someone's house when it is quite sensible and safe to leave one's house. And all the words and the different angles and dreams and help and analyzing sometimes just will not penetrate the neurotic narrative of risk, which is tragic.
Yeah, there's a wonderful quote from Anais Nin that speaks to that. She says, "And the day came when the risk to remain tight inside the bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. Life is a process of becoming a combination of states we have to go through. Where people feel is that they wish to elect a state or remain in it. And sometimes that state is the state of protection, of remaining in the garden, a kind of dream of paradise. If I stay safe inside my house, nothing bad can happen to me."
Deb, you must have been reading my mind, because I'm holding in my hand right now this quote from Barbara Hanna, her book, Striving Towards Wholeness. She says, which I think is relevant to our topic, she says, there are many other people who never really succeed in leaving the vicinity of Eden at all. They are driven out like everyone else, of course, but they camp around its walls, unable to tear themselves away. So I think that this idea about, sort of having to assume just the very real risks of all kinds that go along with leading a full life, it does go along with reluctance to leave the garden. And I love that image of people camping around the walls.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
Yeah. So really, in a way, I think what we're saying is it takes risk tolerance to really access our own full aliveness and not live a half life, sheltered inside a literal house or inside a false narrative.
Or as Hannah was saying, that we become captured by a regressive fantasy that if we continue to meditate upon this kind of nursery school level of care, where the entire universe is focused upon us, shielding us, tending us, accommodating our very young needs, that if we get trapped in that, then anything that moves us away from the child complex feels dangerous and depriving.
So, maybe what we're pointing to here is that first stage of life task, which of course goes all the way through life, of developing ego strength, that I am enough and I am supported by something else.
Yeah, I mean, that opens us up into such very big territory, because I do think that there's a way that we are more able to tolerate risk sometimes if we have, say, a positive or a relatively positive mother or father complex, because those good enough experiences with early caretakers give us the sense that we're standing on some kind of bedrock, that something will catch us if we fall. And that can be a very religious kind of belief, in essence. And I'm not talking about religion in terms of dogma, but a sort of spiritual knowing that you are held in a larger context. If you don't get that from your parents, you may get it somewhere else, including perhaps a faith, or just by sort of sheer force of will, that you get yourself out there in the world and learn that.
Yeah, and that does echo your analogy to parental experiences and complexes very much. The idea of being supported by good gods, because our parents are our first deities. And if they imbue us with a sense of safety and support, we kind of tend to project that onto the world. And also, we're able to tolerate the frustrations, the inevitable slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I was not picked for my third grade kickball team, but I can tolerate that. I'm not done in by it. And that builds this kind of resilience and ego strength, that I can engage the world and I can survive failures, as long as they're not monumental failures.
And from that developmental model dropping into an archetypal level, we're talking about the hero's journey. The Origins and History of Consciousness by Neumann goes into this in great depths, but that every human being is evolved in this archetypal arc, particularly of separating out from the mother complex, separating out from the purely instinctive life, and launching into this process of ego development and this capacity, in many ways, to say no to our fears, to say no to our dependencies. And a substantial element of that is answering the call. I find this fun that we're circling to this place because the etymology of the word risk rises out of the Greek language, and it's traced back to a term that Homer used in the Odyssey. And in that original Greek text, in one of the scenes, Odysseus has been attacked by Zeus, who has sent these two sea monsters, Charybdis and Scylla, to destroy his ship. And the ship is destroyed. Odysseus is cast into the waters, and he survives by coming to a cliff and grabbing the roots of the fig tree, and then eventually finding refuge on the back of a turtle. And so in the original Greek meaning, risk was based in the root that we can cling to in the midst of these God-enforced dangers. And that initial word for the root comes into the Latin as resicum, and as that continued to develop, it became a navigational term called rhiza, which means stone or root or cut out from the firm land. And it was a metaphor for the difficulties one has in avoiding the dangers of the sea. And rhiza is where we get the word rhizome from. And rhizome is the root portion of plants that are hidden under the ground, out of which the plant eventually rises up. So there's this interesting dance in the word risk that holds both the danger that the gods or the natural world could visit upon us, but also the root that we can cling to in order to tolerate and survive it.
Yeah, it's both. And so there's a way that risk is a real encounter with God, whatever we understand that to be.
And that in these encounters, part of the heroic journey is to not succumb.
That's right.
But to claw and swim our way to the cliff wall, to grab the root of life and to not yield, to not give in.
But primarily, the first and most important place where things can go wrong is that we avoid the encounter to begin with, because we say, I can't tolerate that risk. And I'm thinking about, I have people in my practice who, are not, who are vaccinated against COVID, but are still choosing not to leave their homes. And I don't think this is unusual. I have several people in that situation, and I've talked to other clinicians who have noticed the same thing. So the risk has felt unbearable. And so I'm going to turn away from it. And it brings to mind this very important quote of Jung's from volume 5, paragraph 551. He says, "The spirit of evil is fear, negation, the adversary who opposes life in its struggle for eternal duration and thwarts every great deed, who infuses into the body the poison of weakness and age through the treacherous bite of the serpent. He is the spirit of regression, who threatens us with bondage to the mother and with dissolution and extinction in the unconscious. For the hero, fear is a challenge and a task, because only boldness can deliver from fear. And if the risk is not taken, the meaning of life is somehow violated, and the whole future is condemned to hopeless staleness, to a drab gray lit only by will-o'-the-wisps."
It is heart-aching.
Yeah, we have to be able to stand in the risk, to tolerate the risk, just generally, not a specific risk, but in general. If we find our lives taken over, colonized by the need to avoid risk at all costs, then we will expose ourselves to a kind of psychic deadening.
Yeah. I'm going back to all the etymological unpacking you did, Joseph, and the idea of the rhizome, which Jung used as an image any number of times, and that a rhizome is a whole sort of underground web of rootedness. So it's different from just like tree roots, which extend down from one tree, because it's extensive underground. And so if one part is somehow damaged, the rhizome survives. And I'm just entertaining the idea of what it takes developmentally with hopefully positive parental complexes, or later in life with whatever narratives we construct about where the danger is there a sense that we are also supported, that there is something undergirding us, like Odysseus, that there will be a root we can grab hold of, that there has to be something that we can trust beyond just little old me, endangered in a big bad world. Something more than just the hero, undertaking the fight with the dragon. We have to be rooted in something else, at least to believe that something will support us if we take the risk.
Well, if we come back to the myth of Odysseus, that Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, the goddess of heroes, who has the back of those who take the risk, has the back of those who hear the call, the vocatus, which brings us to this modern idea of vocation, that one of the reasons we move beyond our fear is that we are called to something that is more meaningful than our fear. So underneath that, it's the crisis of vocation, which really is a very broad cultural crisis right now, particularly in the United States, where people's ability to go inside, to listen to the rhizome inside the soul, and to validate it and move forward into the journey from the calling. And instead of that, kids are saying, which degree might be profitable. It doesn't really matter if I'm called to it, but when I weigh the burden of the debt that I'm going to achieve in school, then the calling inside of me is not relevant. So the culture right now seems to be kind of harassing the calling and trying to impose many different standards in order to judge whether you are allowed or even worthy of following the calling. And that is a great problem in the culture.
Yeah, I really like how you are moving into a call or vocation, or the telos, the trajectory of life, the life force itself. It's not just that we have to sort of gird our loins and, get out there and do it anyway, feel the fear, but just somehow make yourself do it. It's because we're called to something that we want, something that we perceive, and we have a sense of that we're on earth to do something with ourselves in this world and with our life. And there is desire there. And I think it is growth. We are, that's the individuation urge, psyche's true trajectory.
So the call, in the best circumstance, would rise up from the depths inside of us, the voice of the deep. And the ego's responsibility to that is answering the call. So we come back to this idea of ego strength, which is, what does a person need to answer? And what is the cost for not answering?
So, Joseph, I like that you framed it in terms of the call and what do we need to do in order to answer the call, or perhaps even hear the call. And I think that really what we're trying to get at here is answering the call requires that we be able to face and tolerate risk.
Absolutely. I think actually that hearing the call causes the appearance of all those conflicts, because until we feel that desire, until the self has kind of grabbed us and is making us ache for something, do we become aware of the things we think impede us. And those impediments can be childhood traumas, can be lack of knowledge, can be lack of resources, but it's the calling that then brings to highlight all the things that stand between us and the vision. And one of the things I was thinking about was dreams, and how dreams are so essential for most of us, particularly, again, in this modern age where most of our egos are fairly well educated. We can be very willful, very determined. We can be incredibly reinforced in our belief structures through social media. We can be really encapsulated. So dreams for many people are the last place that we can go where the ego's not interfering with us. So I know all of us have these stories, but I had an idea, a sense of attraction to entering into analytic training, which came upon me when I was 21. But it wasn't until my 40s that it gained steam. And as I was exploring that and I was beginning some initial studies, I had a particular dream which really galvanized the calling for me. And in this dream, I was in an overgrown rural backyard, which I found very beautiful in the dream, that ended in a shallow stream at the bottom of the yard. And I was there with a woman who was my teacher in the dream. And as we were talking together, we were walking along the edges of the large square yard, walking along kind of a hedge of hydrangeas and then turning 90 degrees and walking across the edge of the road and then turning right along the edge of a fence. And so we're circumambulating. And then when we finally get down to the stream bank, I wade into the very shallow stream, and I am remarkably captured by the clearness of the water and the ability to perceive every tiny smoothed pebble on the bed of the stream. And then I woke up with this clarity that it's time to look down into the bed of the stream, down below the water, or what's foundational in my own psyche, over which water moves and is contained. And for me, that gave me the strength and clarity that I was going to answer the call and go in search of knowledge of the stream bed of life. And it carried me through many difficulties, making career changes with my family, finding the money to do it. I had to get a master's degree in order to be able to qualify for the training. But those images in the dream and what it put me in connection to woke up the rhizome to train to be an analyst. And that gave me the strength to deal with Charybdis and Scylla and stormy oceans and all these contentions.
There's something underneath the surface, and that sustains you while you take this tremendous risk. And I remember that step too. It was a huge risk. I mean, to go to graduate school to get that master's degree and think, Jesus, what if I hate this? What if this really isn't it?
I'm thinking in a very concrete way, well, then you could have done something else, then we can always turn around and see what we learned. There's still a gain, even if everything, doesn't wind up, rainbows and puppy dogs. But you would have engaged with yourself. You would have engaged with life. Of course, Lisa and I know your story of what a huge shift it took in every aspect of your life to do that training. And I'm thinking about an example that comes in a way in a smaller size. of someone in my personal life who was an adult and in rather a depressed, lost state. Nothing terribly onerous had happened to her, from the external world. And one Sunday, she woke up and she heard the church bells ringing. And she got up and got dressed and went to that church. And that is another example of clinging to the root that Odysseus found when his ship was wrecked, that something else was there. It was something so simple in terms of concrete actions of get dressed and go to that church. And the discovery of something else that was there to support her, what we would call in Jungian terms, the relativization of the ego, that she belonged to something greater. There was a greater whole that she was part of that supported her. And she became a very active member, and it was very meaningful to this day.
So it speaks to how powerfully these rhizomes can affect our behaviors and our choices once they activate. And that when we wake up remembering a dream, whether it's a dream of church bells or a dream of a stream bed, that the ego is required to reflect upon what has happened in that night vision and to allow the feelings and images to affect the body and the psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And then to choose to go to the church, to answer the call, although one might not know what's going to happen when we arrive.
Yeah, your story about the woman who went to church makes me think of this quote by Joseph Campbell that I think is just sort of perfect to what we're talking about. He says, "I have found you only have to take one step toward the gods, and they will then take 10 steps toward you. That step, the heroic first step of the journey, is out of or over the edge of your boundaries, and it often must be taken before you know that you will be supported." And I think that this is the state that we often find people coming into our consulting rooms in, that maybe there's a step they want to take that's out over the edge of their boundaries. They don't know that they'll be supported. And they come to us and they often feel really paralyzed. And I'm thinking about this woman that I worked with for several years now, many, many years ago, where she was a very talented, intelligent, educated woman. She had all kinds of real strengths, but she had never quite been able to get out into life. She was what we might consider a real underachiever. She, although she had a master's degree, she had never managed to really get out into the professional world. She just would maybe try something for a little while, but then it would seem too much or it would seem too daunting, and she'd, withdraw from the application process, say, so that she never really had a professional job. And she was working, she was just kind of working as a nanny. I worked with her and kind of watched this process of her needing to do exactly what Joseph Campbell is talking about, to just take that one step toward the gods. And at least in the period of time that I worked with her, she was unable to do it.
I wonder if we are also on the brink of the process of discernment around risk. What am I being called to do versus, wait a minute, does this really make sense? Of how do we really wend our way through what is an appropriate risk and what might be just a wild idea. What's too much risk? We've been talking about what is too little risk.
Mm-hmm. Of course, there's the opposite.
Yes, there we have it always.
So we have some kind of an evaluative process that we will go through I mean, we do need our egos. If we hear a call, whether it's a life-changing call or a call that's going to change the day, the ego still is required to sort out the details. What am I going to wear to the church? What time is the service? I've got to get a little information with the story you had said, Deb, or I had to get a huge amount of information and planning to work that piece for me. But the ego is very much involved in the crafting of the response. And one of the things that we're talking about is the difference between risk and perceived risk, and all of the tensions that, in a very grounded, realistic way, people are navigating. I do want to bring up a really ubiquitous experience right now, which I am seeing in my practice. I know you guys are. People who have been isolated for a year or longer, obeying the scientific advice around COVID infection. I have some clients who have been vaccinated. They believe the vaccine is efficacious. They're using mask compliance. And when they imagine answering the call to walk down the street, or to go back and take a painting class, or to meet somebody out for dinner in an outdoor cafe, they are paralyzed with anxiety and are finding themselves unable to answer the call.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm surmising is that there is a COVID complex. If we just use Jung's model, that when we have a large grouping of negative memories around a topic, like leaving the house, those memories all cluster together inside the psyche and synergistically become increasingly more powerful. And their power exerts an effect on our body, our mind, our feeling states. And so when I think about several of my clients, they're in their hallways looking at the door, and there is a dweller on the threshold. And the dweller on the threshold reminds them of the manifold memories of risk. And even though the ego's like telling itself, I've been vaccinated, I follow all the protocols, there's a minuscule or perhaps no risk at all, they can't seem to pass through the dweller on the threshold. And then we're left trying to figure out how to awaken enough heroic dynamism so that they can re-enter into life. And it has been quite a challenge for me.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you wholeheartedly, Joseph. I think you're right. There is, for those of us in areas of the world where there are increasingly high vaccination rates, and it is getting safer. There is this kind of COVID complex that keeps us trapped because we cannot tolerate the risk. And the thing about risk is that you don't really know. I mean, that's in the very definition. They tell us that the vaccines are 94% effective or something like that. So there's still some risk. And you cannot personally guarantee an individual that you won't be the one to catch it in spite of the fact that you've been vaccinated. That's just the nature of risk, is that it is unknown. It cannot be entirely controlled for. There's always some risk. But can we open ourselves up? Can we enlarge ourselves enough to encompass the ability to move forward into life in spite of not having a guarantee? Life doesn't come with a guarantee. I'm thinking actually about I'm thinking about Little Briar Rose, the Grimm's fairy tale that is somewhat better known as Sleeping Beauty. And Sleeping Beauty's parents are told at her christening that she's been cursed and that she will prick herself on a spindle on her 15th birthday and fall down dead. And then that is actually softened, and no, she's just going to fall asleep. So what her parents do is forbid there to be any spindles in the kingdom. They are going to eliminate any risk that this could happen. And what do they do by eliminating the risk? They actually potentiate this foretold disaster because she doesn't know what a spindle is. And so when she finally sees one, of course, on her 15th birthday, she's fascinated by it and she needs to go try it. So she goes up, on her 15th birthday, she's alone in the castle and she finds her way to this unused room at the very top of a tower. And there's an old woman with a spindle. And she just is fascinated. And what is this but an image of her encounter with her fate? Because we know that in all of the mythological traditions, the fates are spinners and weavers of human destiny. She had to have that encounter with her fate, even though her parents wanted to avoid it because of the risk. And she did, of course, as we all know, fall asleep, as did the rest of the castle, which I think is also relevant here because this is what happens when we try to avoid risk, is it's deadening. Life comes to a standstill and it doesn't move forward.
That just seems like the perfect illustration of what happens when we are too risk avoidant, is that we actually potentiate the very thing we are trying to guard against. And that psyche writ large, as the fate, is there to ensure that life will, in fact, take us down the road we've been trying to avoid. I am still interested in the other side of this, of people that take really, really big risks of, climbing big mountaintops or scaling rock faces without ropes.
Yeah. Did you see the movie Free Solo?
Yes. My stomach was in knots. And I know that there's research about people, and more often males than females, and younger people, that some of us are more sort of hardwired to need stimulation. Some of us are more hardwired for physical ability and physical challenge. And I can imagine that it served us in an evolutionary way, with that those might have been the people that ventured out to settle new lands and humanity spread across the face of the earth. But I'm also thinking of people in my practice who at a crossroads in life will come up with something like, I'm going to quit my job and move across the country, of just a sudden vacating of a way of life, perhaps a relationship, a job, a whole career, and just move into the opposite of part of the country. Sometimes I call it the geographic cure. And what that is like in the psyche of ignoring a risk, and there are people, to use your examples of COVID, who flaunted all of the standard medical advice and put themselves at risk. And a couple of harrowing stories of people who then caught COVID and died, like Herman Cain, who had once run for president, who ignored COVID risk and died. So let's kind of talk about that, of ignoring appropriate cautions, let's call it.
Well, it's hubristic, isn't it? I mean, if we're going to go back to that idea of the rhizome, I think what we come up with by looking at the etymology of risk is that it's both the sense that we are tempest tossed by the gods, an awareness of how small we are, and a sense of trusting that there will be something there when we reach for it. I think what can happen when we underestimate risk is we feel invincible, and we've arrogated a kind of godlike certainty that we're fine, we're immune to risk.
Or immune to danger or negative outcome. There's also a dimension in some human beings where they are sensation seeking. If somebody does not experience their inner life as vibrant enough or perhaps even neurologically, they are overregulated in themselves. They will find, often starting in childhood, that by taking increasingly more dramatic risks, they have a sense of just being alive. I mean, why do people jump out of planes to parachute and free fall
It beats me.
thousands of feet? I mean, I don't need that much adrenaline to feel
No.
alive.
I've had friends who have done that. Hey, it's my 40th birthday. Here I go. And I'm like, that's
But
I think I'll just have some champagne.
for some people, the inner world is set in just tones of gray. And no matter how they responsibly engage life and their children and their spouses, the grayness is never punctuated by color. And they discover taking risks or doing things that arouse them in some fashion are the only thing that can give them a sense of being alive. And the pain of feeling dead is so problematic that they are willing to risk injury, money, gambling, even the risk of getting arrested in order to just feel alive.
So there is a way where we have a need. We have a need for challenge. We have a need for intense experience. We have a need for risk. And I think that there is a relationship between risk and initiation, that we have to be able to undergo a real risk. We have to really risk something in order to be opened up to life. And we all do have a drive to throw ourselves into the fires of life, especially as young people.
Well, there's that appropriate answering the call, the appropriate desire for experience and growth. And then there's that taken to an extreme,
That's right.
as we were mentioning before. And there's also another behavior which is less common, but visible, which is called counterphobic behavior, where people are situated in their personality in such a way that when they see something dangerous, they will suppress the sense of danger and run towards it, and often wind up in hot water. And this is less about sensation seeking, but it is some kind of a problematic way that they respond to trying to triumph over something.
And that is very much aligned with the phenomenon called reaction formation of I cannot bear to be afraid of this or somehow averse to it, and I must therefore suppress it and go toward it. So that kind of goes to the process of discernment. And I want to link it up back to what you said, Joseph, about arousal as an antidote to grayness, or this counterphobic behavior or reaction formation as an antidote to a feeling, and how important it is to know and reflect on, as they say, where you're coming from when considering something risky. And am I doing it defensively to fend off something inside myself? Do I need arousal to counteract an inner sense of deadness? Or is this the kind of initiatory risk that is necessary to get me into life? It can be a very big process, and many people conflate excitement with something that has an inherent worth to it.
Things that are exciting are not inherently developmentally valuable or not necessarily aligned with the self. I'm also wondering about the way in which this can be projected. For instance, I'm thinking about this phenomena of the helicopter parent, where they're monitoring their own sense of what risk means to a child, and then they become over-aggressively involved in mediating all kinds of conditions around the child. And clearly, in my experience of observing this, The parents are projecting their own unresolved resentments towards authority figures or authoritative systems. They're going to fight with the teachers that they couldn't fight with when they themselves were children. They're also forcing their children to stay encamped around the walls of Eden. They want their kids to stay in an Edenic, childish, unchallenged place to continue to hold the parents' inner child, their own desire for an Edenic experience. And so we can interfere with the development of a child's natural resilience and their ability to figure out how to navigate complex systems. And I've seen parents, destroy the career of a middle school teacher because they weren't accommodating enough, or they refused to give the child an A, which they did not agree with and they did not earn. So the ferocity and viciousness that some parents will deliver in order to hyper-modulate their children's environment is really pathological.
I mean, it can be very difficult as a parent to watch our children be in risky situations of any kind. And there is a tremendous desire to try to mitigate or eliminate that risk for our children.
I'm comparing this with the natural parental desire, to give our children a better childhood, one that's more empathic, has more opportunities, presence, resources, all kinds of things that most of us as parents really want for our children. And then have the awareness of when that is tilting over into the parent's need to live a life through their children that is unblemished, untainted by failure or hardship or frustration, versus what my kid really needs. You didn't do the work, and you just got a D in social studies. And that I have confidence that you, little Billy, are going to be able to weather the terrible storm of going to summer school.
Absolutely. I think it's putting the risks and the risk of discomfort and displeasure, which has become the great kind of festering problem, I think, in the United States, putting that in right order. That the idea of optimal stress that I know you've talked about, Lisa, is necessary for adults and children to actualize. Every child's optimal stress is different. Every human being's optimal stress is different based on genetic factors, if not 100 other things. But we do know that human beings need a certain amount of challenge or they will not grow and can become remarkably dysfunctional.
Yes.
So I'd like to leave this session of risk and facing risk with a small quote from one of my favorite poems. I know I've quoted it before, which is Ulysses by Lord Tennyson. It's just the final stanza that I'll read. Odysseus now is an old man. He's gone back to the kingdom. He's back with his wife, and he's just bored. Everything is repetitive. His son has taken over all the administrative stuff, and he's miserable, just hanging around, getting old. So he gathers up his old crew, and they're really old at this point, and he says, "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be that we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles, whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved heaven and earth, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
That's great.
Oh my goodness. There is an inner journey. Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work, but producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
So today's dream comes from a woman who is 30 years old and she is a student. And here's the dream. In the countryside, I find a baby crawling on the side of a road with some cars driving by. I saw the mother earlier and I judge her for being so irresponsible. It enrages me, but I fear expressing my rage. I do not want to provoke drama from her. I pick up the baby and bring it to where she stays with her family in a holiday home. The family doesn't take her so seriously, but when I place the baby with them, they are not even surprised or shocked about that. She seems unimpressed as well. I still worry for drama coming from them, but it doesn't seem to come. The baby appears unbothered too. And here's the context. She says, lately I am changing significantly from assuming victimhood to recognizing responsibility for my inner states. And she says of the feelings in the dream, she felt fear, anger, resentment in the beginning, confusion, and some release in the end. And finally, she notes that the mother in the dream was someone I used to resent in real life for being irresponsible, emotionally, and expressive in her anger.
The dream slightly short circuits me because in one sense, the dream maker might be encouraging her to be more resilient to distress or getting over involved in the drama of other people's lives. But a baby crawling on the side of the road is really a dangerous, horrifying image.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of caught between these two different dimensions.
Well, here's what I do with it. I love that you said it short circuits you, because that is exactly how I feel about half the time when I look at a dream. But this one I sort of had a hit with. So the mother of the baby is a shadow figure. And the mother of this baby, she says, is someone that she used to resent because she's irresponsible and emotional and expresses her anger a lot, right? So these are shadow qualities. The ego, I imagine, of this person is very conscientious, identified with sort of doing the right thing, with being very careful. So the shadow of that is someone who appears from an ego standpoint to be irresponsible. And also, I think really interestingly and significantly, she can express anger. So the ability to express anger is in the shadow for this dreamer, not something I imagine that she's capable of doing consciously very well. So I take your point, though, Joseph. There is a baby crawling on the side of the road with some cars driving by. But what we do know is that the baby is okay and the baby is not even bothered. So I think that this might be one of the cases where the situation looks really dangerous from the ego perspective, but there's other information in the dream that says it's really okay. It looks horrifying, but it's really okay. And that the ego, I think, interesting to what she notes about her own transformation, the ego seems to want to inhabit a self-righteous stance against this mother. And how could you do this to this baby? When in fact, it's sort of like, relax. You don't have to take up the cudgel. You don't have to beat other people for having endangered your inner baby. Your inner baby is a little bit more resilient than that.
What comes up for me is a pattern that is often seen in relational trauma. We have the victim and we have the perpetrator, and they're clearly imaged in this dream. The victim is the baby. Yeah, that's right. And the rescuer. So the dream ego is outraged, and the baby is the victim. The uncaring, oblivious family are the perpetrators. And in the psyche, this is often the result of early and or relational trauma, where parts of us become separated and split off. And the idea here is to get those parts into dialogue. And here they are in the dream. They're all meeting each other.
Yeah, yeah. Deb, I love that you brought that up. And in fact, that's often referred to as the drama triangle.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And that is exact. She says she's worried about drama. and that pattern of the victim, the perpetrator, and the rescuer is referred to as the drama triangle.
Yeah. And she says that she's changing significantly lately. And this dream is evidence of that.
So taking what you guys are bringing to the surface, which is helping me enter into the dream more, and thinking about it, as you were saying, Deb, as an outpicturing of a trauma system in the psyche. I'm thinking about the baby crawling at the side of the road, having to do with her own infantile instincts and needs. I'm thinking about the family being neglectful and perhaps even dissociated, and her own rage, the dreamer's rage, about being neglected both as a child and perhaps even as an adult. And the difficulty for me at the end of the dream is that she doesn't keep the baby, but she returns the baby to the same neglectful, dissociated scene inside of her. And she says that the baby appears to be unbothered, as if it's a diminishment of the fact that it was crawling around the side of a street. But we also know that babies will dissociate when they are neglected. So there can be no outer sign of distress, but inwardly, and in the nervous system, there can be an enormous amount of distress and discord. So one challenge that I might suggest to the listener is to decide you're not going to abandon the baby to these internal figures that do not know how to care for it, and that connecting to the baby fills you with rage. So that can be a restoration of lost affect, primal affect. The kinds of feelings that babies have is both restorative and deeply frightening to people. In an analytic process, people may drop down and feel a level of rage or grief or crying or violence, which, by the way, is natural to infants. If you've never seen a baby get angry or cry, you haven't seen the great storms that human beings are capable of. That when a baby's angry, it's angry with every cell in its body. There's just no mediation around the passion that we generate when we don't have that ego regulation.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a regression there when the baby and the ego connect, which evokes an enormous storm of feeling in her. The fact that she interprets that as a victimization, that attitude, I think, is where the growth is happening already because she's challenging it. But there's some work to be done about accepting primal affect, I suspect.
Yeah, I think that's a place where I have some focus too, that it is primal affect, and in a trauma system, that is what has to be suppressed at all costs, not just against the perpetrating others, because the child is small and family members are big and needed desperately, But also what happens internally for that person is that internally there is a mechanism that attacks the self for even feeling anger or rage. So it happens externally in a family system, and then it happens internally in the person. And that is, what I'm really paying attention to. She says, I fear expressing my rage. I don't want to provoke drama. And then at the end, I still worry for drama. And that one of the elements in recovering from what I'm obviously inferring is a trauma history, which may or may not be accurately, is to be able to have access to anger and to humanize it, to move it from that primordial instinctive realm that you're talking about, Joseph, that it's just cataclysmic rage, to it is human anger, which means that the person has moved from a dissociative system into a conflict system. Now I can have conflict with people. I don't need to split it off. So I'm thinking that more, or perhaps aside from whether the dream depicts rescuing the baby and keeping the baby or returning it to the original family system, that maybe the message of the dream is, how do you get in conflict with those internal people in yourself represented as the family? How do we start to fight about this? Because in conflict, you're engaging, and that's healthy.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you've both brought, and I agree with it. And I still hold this other perspective that's somewhat at odds with it, that it's a possibility. One of the ways to slip out of life and kind of get encapsulated is to adopt a kind of victimhood mentality where we have a tendency to gin up the dangers or the oppression that we see that we're being faced with. And that involves a kind of splitting where everything that we do is right and everything that other people do is wrong. And that seems to be outpictured in this little system in this dream too, that the ego is in the right and the mother and the family is in the wrong. And the ego has this sort of puffed up, this kind of inflation around that, filled with this rage, when in fact it may be that the situation is quite other than that. And that the ego is sort of over responding to something that's really not quite as serious. And I know that sounds like exactly the opposite of what you said, Joseph, but I think there's a way they could both be true.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I think the fact that she's moving out of victimhood is a sign of that. When people are trapped in the victim complex, then things are exaggerated, and the victim is constantly placing themselves in the center of conflicts that may not even involve them.
Right. It does seem to me that there's something she says that there's a little bit of a release at the end of the dream. It's like, oh, I could give this baby back, and this could be okay.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point. Just going back to the dream, the mother is unimpressed, that the drama doesn't come, and the baby feels unbothered. So maybe a tendency to sort of catastrophize when perhaps the situation isn't quite that dire. The dream maker depicts it as dire, but that may be pointing to her affective response, a habitual affective response that isn't always really necessary.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.